Hello and welcome to Until Saturday, the Athletics College Football Podcast. One of these days, we're going to get you guys to officially answer a poll of whether or not in our logo the kick is coming up short or it's going through the uprights, whether it's a kick six moment or a made kick. But until then, subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. Leave a comment. If it's an interesting comment or you got some questions, we might include it in a future Mailbag podcast like this one with myself, David Ubben, and Pete Sampson, who covers Notre Dame and does other stuff for us as well. We got a lot to get to today, Pete. A lot has happened in college football. We're going to be talking a lot of realignment today, but also some actual football, maybe. But you can also subscribe to us on YouTube. So if you got a chance to do that as well. Pete, let's get into this. I think we'll kick us off with, I think, a big picture question. And I think this is something that with all the fireworks of the weekend, it sort of slid under the radar. And that is, what happens to the playoff? Does anything replace the Pac-12 as a P5 conference? And what does that mean for automatic bids? But when we look at the major conferences, we have a question here from Brad slash modeled pause. I don't know what that is. I hope it's a dog reference. I don't know. But this question is pretty simple. Which conference will rise up to replace the Pac-12 as a Power 5 group and get an auto bid? Or why do you think that won't happen? I'll let you go first here, Pete.
There won't be another conference to rise up because who's calling the shots? It's the Big Ten, it's the SEC, it's Fox, it's ESPN. Are we living in a world where the American Athletic Conference or the WAC or the Mountain West is going to drive TV dollars? Like, if anything, in the last 72 hours, which it was just like a sobriety check that no football rules or television rules the football world. Television is not going to allow another automatic bid to come from an even lesser conference than the ones that are already out there. So no, there won't be one because the people that print the money don't want another one. And so there will be the 5 automatic bids. There will be a Power 4, which is really a Power 2 and a somewhat power-ish 2, and then whoever is left over from that. So yeah, there won't be another one.
First of all, I do like our friend's Twitter avatar. I feel like that's either Maurice Clawrette or maybe like a Cat Krenzel, something.
I don't know how they got that. I mean, the helmet on the cat is impressive because we know that cat did not go willingly into that.
Whether it's Photoshop or animal abuse, it's impressive either way.
Yes.
One of those two. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately there's a question to be said for how the playoff is going to work now in the 12-team era because, the Big Ten and the SEC are under no, demands to say, hey, whatever becomes of the Mountain West or the Pac, or if, whatever those 4 teams decide to do, whoever they pair up with may or may not have an auto bid, and that can change. The thing about college football is that the rules are constantly changing. So maybe year 1 they stick around just because it's too complicated to fix in, what do we have now? Literally like 12 months before you kind of have to have the rules in place. And so the short answer is there's not going to be one. I mean, that it's going to be 4 big conferences, 2 conferences that really matter, a giant Big 12 that will be very fun, and an ACC, which are playing a giant 14-legged race where they want to kill each other, and Florida State is making all kinds of threats, and I think the first chance they can get into the SEC or the Big Ten will be interesting. And I think we've referenced this on the show, but for all the Florida State conversation, the chatter when you talk to people, a lot more chatter around North Carolina than Florida State or Clemson, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, so the ACC and what becomes of that. I mean, it's a Notre Dame topic for me in my world because, like, if the ACC falls apart, where does that leave Notre Dame? That's their arrangement with them has been somewhat tentative. I think the ACC has hoped that Notre Dame could sort of be a white knight for that league. They're not going to ride in on anything ever for them. So at this point, if you're Florida State, or you're North Carolina, or you're Clemson, like there's no reason to wait around other than the private equity 120 million plus 300 million of grant and aids. It just is. It's a lot of money, but man, the noise that Florida State made last week was more topical in my world up here with Notre Dame than even the Oregon and the Washington news.
Well, it's worth moving on. Chris Avros, Stringfellow 911 says, what becomes of Notre Dame's Olympic sports if football remains independent and the ACC experiences defections? Pete, you've touched on this in a recent mailbag. You guys can read it, The Athletic. But what does Notre Dame do here?
I mean, I still think they have pretty good options because it's okay. There's one, you could stick with the corpse of the ACC, whatever that is, and say, you know what, instead of playing 4 or 5 games a year, we're going to pull back and maybe we'll just do 2 or 3. So we'll help you a little bit, but we can't have a football schedule where the draw is Wake Forest, Boston College, Louisville, Georgia Tech, NC State. Like that can't be a football schedule for Notre Dame. Or do you pull out of the ACC entirely, go back to like full independence, where they were in 2013 and backwards, and then join the Big East in all your Olympic sports, which would look a lot like the Big East before, just a little bit more Midwest with, Butler and Creighton, DePaul and Marquette is there. I think the geography would be better. And that would free up football scheduling. When the playoff expands, I don't think that Notre Dame is going to feel as pressured to go undefeated every year to make it. I think 10-2 will be good enough a lot of times. 11-1 will always be good enough. So I think that they will have some options before you get to the nuclear option of joining the Big Ten entirely. I think that would be a last resort because it would be a very lucrative resort. But I think that, sticking with ACC in some capacity, but then the Big East, I think if you can negotiate something with them for all your Olympic sports, that would be very workable as well.
Sticking with that, it's worth continuing the Notre Dame conversation a little bit here. You had another question from Joe B, who I assume is Joe Burrow. Thanks for reading, Joe. Appreciate you getting the reading in during training camp. But he said, with the Big Ten adding Oregon and Washington, could this be the realignment round that finally puts Notre Dame in a conference? And how does Notre Dame take a now or never approach from the Big Ten? Pete, I'll tackle this and you tell me if I'm wrong. This is a very common question that I think has come up in this round of realignment, and I truly don't understand it. I don't think anything that's happened affects Notre Dame football in any real way. I truly don't see it. If Notre Dame wants to do whatever they want to do tomorrow, they can do that, and that's probably not going to change. This is the luxury of having probably the biggest fan base in college football and the biggest TV draw. You're the only school that has a real TV deal that you can sort of live with. I think Texas, there's always that thing thrown around, but they've never actually done it. BYU did it by force for a while, but was after not long was trying to beat their way into the first conference they could get into and did that in the Big 12. I kind of don't think anything that's happened in the last 5 years has changed or affected anything that Notre Dame thinks about football independence. The other sports are a little more complicated, which you hit on, but am I wrong that if I'm Notre Dame, I'm looking at all the moves the last 5 years and combined with the expanded playoff, I'm kind of shrugging and calling up my buddies at NBC and saying, hey guys, how's it going? Let's go play golf this week.
Yeah, I think mostly correct. I think that Notre Dame probably looks at the just insanity of the last week and says, wait a minute, you want us to voluntarily associate with you people? Like, are you crazy? Like, you're joking, right? So I think it makes independence more attractive from you get to make your own decisions. But I think what really has affected Notre Dame and its ability to be independent or not in the last, in this last cycle, it's the Big Ten TV deal and it's the SEC TV deal, because if those two leagues pull away to such a point that NBC is unwilling to match or cannot match, get Notre Dame close to those leagues from a revenue point of view, then maybe the Big Ten looks all right. But, talking to people around Notre Dame, if they can get within $10 to $15 million of those leagues, and that's, you take NBC plus the revenue you get from the ACC, if you combine those together and you're $10 to $15 million short of the Big Ten or the SEC, then Notre Dame they're fine with that. They'll live with that. They'll sort of pay that independent tax. But that if the SEC numbers and the Big Ten numbers get to a point where NBC is like, you know what, we're not in this game anymore, then I think Notre Dame could be in some trouble. But if NBC is willing to pay for the Big Ten, and that money is going to Northwestern and Iowa, you would think they would be willing to come up and have more money go to Notre Dame, which is just a better property overall.
Yeah, I think in general, there's a very interesting conversation to be had that we've already seen in the last, I'm trying to think how far back to go. I will just say 5 years, that if you were under any, misgivings that there was any sense of loyalty in college sports when it comes to conference affiliation, that it's a little bit naive. And I think that as you sort of start continuing to claw around for money wherever you can find it, I mean, the contraction conversation, I think, got a lot more interesting after this weekend, because you talk to different administrators in different places. And I've had a few conversations here and there over the last couple of years about, what do you think? Is that something? And nobody's really willing to really talk about it. But if you're an AD or a president at a Northwestern or at a Vanderbilt or at a Rutgers, how are you not nervous? How do you not know that, hey, at some point, like, if the Big Ten all of a sudden is $12 million, $15 million, that gap is growing between the Big Ten and the SEC, and you're Vanderbilt, how do you know the knives aren't going to turn on you and say, hey, if we just kick them out, we could split up their $60-70 million share between all of us?
Right.
Like, that feels like a question of when, not if.
Yeah, and it's like, for the Big Ten in particular, if you come to Notre Dame and be like, all right, we're going to, Notre Dame can be viewed as a Chicago school. It can be viewed as a New York school, depending on how you want, where your geographical alignments are. Really, Notre Dame is rooted in both. So Notre Dame could get you both markets. And, in that world, if you're Northwestern, if you're Rutgers, like, what are you bringing to the table at that point? Because Notre Dame can probably replace both and then some. So, yeah, I would be a little leery of that if I was an also ran in some of these schools that maybe is just like not really a cultural fit. I don't think like IU or Purdue are in any trouble, but if you don't have any athletic history to speak of at all, then what are you bringing to the table, when what you need to be bringing to the table is not just a win for Ohio State or Michigan or Penn State. You got to be bringing in 65, 75, $85 million of value. And certainly those schools are not doing that.
Yeah. We got Jonathan Conrad on Twitter who wants to know, David, where do you think my alma mater, NC State, will end up? And here's where I sort of, well, no disrespect to the question, but let's not really talk about NC State. I'm going to talk about the NC State adjacent types, right? NC State, Texas Tech, those sort of schools. And most of the Big 12 now, the schools that like have done some things and care, but are not the blue bloods, but still have like good facilities, and they can pack their stadium out when they're good, and they can beat the really good schools, and they'll win, 6 to 10 games, more years than not. I'm scared for them, because as you look and you sort of mess with the crystal ball, right? My number one fear in the future of college football that I think, because this version of college football that we have now, I don't like it. I'm still gonna watch it. I'm still gonna pay attention to it. My number one fear in the future is that we're gonna go truly a full NFL model, and that the Big Ten and the SEC are gonna figure out, why are we playing anybody else again? And they just decide that you're gonna play 9 SEC teams and 3 Big Ten teams, and we're gonna keep it all in the family, and everybody's gonna, make hay. And the schools from the ACC that don't get into that big table, and the Big 12 teams that get left behind, they don't even get to play those games anymore. That's my fear. That, I think, turns college football into something truly disgusting is too far, but truly
Not that
depraved.
too far.
But truly depraved of what are we doing here? You're taking out all of basically Cinderella, we're gonna take you out back and give you the old Yeller treatment. All right. It's all blue bloods here. That's my fear. And that is a future that I don't want for the NC States of the world, the Arizona States of the world, the Texas Techs of the world, the Oklahoma States of the world. These proud programs that do have some tradition and do have facilities and in any normal view look like major college football. But at the top, ESPN and Fox look at them and they say,
no value.
Get out of here. Get out of here. Michigan, come take a seat.
It's gross. And that's, the scheduling collusion scenario. That's how Notre Dame ends up having to join a conference against its will. That, to me, that's really the only way that it happens. Other than NBC saying you know what, we'd like to, I know we've been together for 35 years, and you just hired our chairman of NBC Sports to be your athletic director, but we're going to part ways. That's not happening. A world where these schools, I don't know, what do we have? 2 20-team super conferences? Do you think we get to that and stop?
That seems however round we want to make the numbers, that seems like where we're looking.
Yeah, 20, 22 teams. That's, man, that's a critical mass of the sport. And the teams that are joining them, all due respect to Cal and Stanford, maybe joining the ACC here for a hot minute. They're not, the teams that are joining are desired. NC State, is NC State desired? Is Texas Tech desired? I don't think so. It's the blood sport to be the last team in, the last team on the lifeboat. That's going to be, Fox and ESPN could probably come up with a really good playoff just to be the last team in. Just have Texas Tech and NC State play against each other in the existential bowl. The winner survives, the loser dies.
We're talking about a Bachelor spinoff show of which I would truly watch. As Oklahoma State accepts a rose and then eventually gets sent home crying in the limo after they get to the hometowns, and we can leave it up to people's imaginations what a fantasy suite week would look like with these guys. But ultimately,
the mascot possibilities are gross.
But ultimately, shout out to Otto the Orange, by the way. But ultimately, this is a world in which I don't really want to live. I can't say that I wouldn't watch it, but as sad as this weekend made me, that future would make me that would turn it to anger for me.
I would hate watch it. And I don't I love college football. I don't want to hate watch this sport. This, it's one of our old colleagues used to say one of the beauties of this whole enterprise is that no one is in charge. And that was true really until last week. Because there is someone in charge. It's just the TV networks. And I think we've all come to accept that in the last week or so, and it's just gross. I hate it. It's just disgusting. But it's the deal the sport has made with itself, and now unfortunately they have to live with it.
Well, they've made their bed, and now they can lie in it, but it's got bed bugs.
With Otto the Orange.
Yeah, with Otto the Orange. Chad Bradley, I think, is calling out. There was a before we get to the question, I did see this sort of school of thought as people were universally panning all of these moves, which is oh, this is groupthink. It's like, is it groupthink or is it just terrible? So Chad Bradley on Twitter asks, were you as upset when the WAC died? The Southwest Conference, the Big 8, Big East football. Honestly, do you miss any of those 4 conferences? Aren't things better in almost every way now compared to when those 4 conferences exist? No, they're not. Chad, I'm sorry. So recently we did a realignment series where we wrote stories about realignment. And one of the things that I wrote was, everybody talks about this sucks. Well, what would it look like if we could do things the right way? And I think smaller conferences are better. And I revived the Big East, and it's awesome. I put all the Florida schools in there, including the Gators. The one mistake I made, the one mistake I will give people, is I booted I booted Illinois from the Big Ten and put them into the Big 8. I should reverse that. Illinois should stay. Iowa should go into the former Big 8. Join Iowa State. Anyway, go read the story. I forget what the headline was, but it's essentially if common sense replaced.
Yeah, common sense conferences.
Pretty much.
Yeah, and
that's so. Yeah,
because don't people enjoy winning things?
Listen, you're about to get me on a soapbox because
okay.
I enraged my home state with 2 separate columns over a course of a year. Arkansas is like patient zero for this because they have traded on tradition and winning football to be members of the big bad SEC so they can chant SEC whenever they beat someone or watch someone beat someone. And they haven't won pretty much anything in 30 years. This program that had won a lot of conference titles, had won national championships, plural, had done really great things. They haven't experienced any of that since coming to the SEC. And the fans think that it's the best thing ever. And I'm like, if you were in the Big 12, you would have a lot more fun. You could go to a lot more road games. You'd probably win more. And you'd get to recruit Texas and beat Texas teams. And people got very mad. And then the Big 12 broke up. Well, not broke up, but Texas and Oklahoma left like 3 weeks later. And people came at me and were like, nice call. And it's like, no, I still believe that. I still think yes, that's great that you get to wear the SEC crest on your chest. But I think rivalries and winning should mean something. And I think that has been lost. And I think part of the sadness with the Pac-10 is all those leagues that you mentioned. And the Southwest Conference is a little bit different because the best leagues or the best teams in that league basically went to form the Big 12 in sort of a messy shotgun marriage. But West Coast football and the Pac-10 has been a century-long tradition. And because of geography, they've kind of been like the last sort of stronghold of this is West Coast football. We are all the major West Coast Conference football schools. And for that to cease to exist, we've lost a major conference on the West Coast. There is no West Coast conference of schools. There is no identity in football that says, hey, we're the folks on the West Coast. And in a sport where regionalism helped build it into what it is today, to lose that's really where most of the sadness is from. And it's hard to believe in a conference that has seen Heisman Trophy winners and dynasties and national championships and all of these things just doesn't exist anymore. Sorry.
Yeah, it's the winning part. Do you think Penn State would have more fun in the Big East than the Big Ten?
They were in my Big East, for the record.
Yeah,
my Big East was awesome.
Yeah, how are things going for Miami right now? They were. UCLA is essentially going to turn into an Instagram version of Purdue. They're not going to win anything ever again in football. So is that worth it? I don't know. I can't get my head around becoming a also ran voluntarily for the sake of money. Because I got to think, I realize Clemson is in that group with Florida State. They're like, we gotta get out of here. Have you had a good time if you're a Clemson fan over the last 10 years?
I think you've had a great time.
Let me know. Has that been good? Has that been good for you? Because if you're in the SEC, it wouldn't be nearly as fun. If you're in the Big Ten, it wouldn't be nearly as fun. So I just don't get it. I don't get the rush to essentially kill your chances to win because you can't control your budget or you need an extra $10 million. Like, I get money, like everyone has a budget, but to me, it was like no one at the end of like, has anyone stormed the field over a budgetary surplus before?
We might get there.
Yeah.
We
I mean,
were
that's like,
doing a podcast earlier this week about the realignment and all the things that happened over the weekend and that discussion. And we kind of hit on, I'm very curious when the tipping point, when people started keeping score of conference payouts started. I think it was 2008, 9-ish. One of the things that I wonder about, and maybe this is, I don't know what to think about this, but it's something that I have thought about in recent years is, I was at ESPN in like 2010 and we started these conference blogs, these network conference blogs. And there was a level of tribalism that really developed in all of those sort of worlds. I did the Big 12, Chris Lowe and the late Ed Ashoff were doing a lot of the SEC. They don't exist anymore. Part of me wonders if we contributed to that in some way, because it was around that time that like we started seeing, well, actually the Big Ten's better than the SEC because we make more money, even though you guys are holding up all those trophies. We don't really care about that. And like when I was a kid, and maybe you could speak to this, do you even remember hearing about or knowing about how much money any conference made? And now, not only does it drive everything, most fans seem to know exactly where they stand in the pecking order. And it's weird because, as I've said and written many, many times in the last 5 to 10 years, the fans don't see that money. It doesn't affect you at all. It affects administrators, and you can get a new water slide and recording studio and barbershop in the facility, but like it doesn't affect you.
That's Arkansas's win.
Yes.
Because it's the only win that these schools can have. Like, I don't think Alabama or Georgia give a crap about what money comes in, whether it's 100 million, 90 million, 80 million. Like, it does not matter. They're trying to win games, and they do a damn good job of it.
Congratulations on the new suites, guys. Everyone.
Yeah, Arkansas is just like, well, we're going to hold this over Texas and Oklahoma until they show up here. This is how we beat them, by media rights revenues. Like, it's just boring and soulless. And I feel like we're also getting to the point where, I mean, I realize TV ratings were always sort of like mildly interesting, but like that's like the new final score of the game.
Yes.
Like you're going to go cover Red River, and I'll be like, David, how was Red River? And you'll be like, 10.2 million people watched it. I'm like, well, who won? And it was like, I don't know. It's 10.2 million people watched it. Like, as if that's the new box score. Like,
we'll find out next June how valuable
it's just soulless. So yeah, that adds to all the depressing parts of this new era of college football, where it's dominated by balance sheets and television ratings and television executives that just sort of see the sport as like revenue. I mean, I feel like college football has sort of been taken over by venture capital in some ways, and it just feels gross.
It's content, and part of it, I wonder if DVR and TiVo are never invented, and if live sports don't become the most valuable live broadcast property, if you could still like fart out another season of Friends or whatever, and you could make a ton of money off of like network sitcoms, and that was a thing, are we in a better place? I kind of feel like probably, but for as much money as they put in the live rights, I think TV networks see, well, this is the last place we have to really make a lot of money.
Yeah, and it's just, I think there's a cultural element there too, where like everything is national now. Like there's no sort of like this local thing that ties people together as strongly as it used to. Like, I grew up in Michigan, and Michigan State was the thing all year. Like, I didn't watch the Iron Bowl or care how many people tuned into that, or it's like the Big Ten went out to, the Rose Bowl that was it. Like, that was your national championship. If you made it to the Rose Bowl, that was as good as it got. And if you like, the national championship was sort of like this extra thing that nobody really understood because people were voting on it in hotel ballrooms. Like it now, I just think that's the only thing that matters, and the sport is so national that it's lost that sort of regional uniqueness, which is one of the main reasons why it's so different from the NFL in the first place. Like you watch an NFL game, you're cheering for a corporation. Like college never felt that way, and it feels a lot more like that today than it did last week or last year or 2 years ago.
Fantastic. I feel like a ray of sunshine right now. Justin Becker asks another realignment question here. Is it important for teams switching conferences to do well in their final season before switching? Is it more important for the remaining teams to do well against these leaving teams? I covered the Big 12 for a long time. I've seen a lot of these moves. I've been in a lot of these games. It's complicated, and it depends on the circumstances. Before all this happened, I think USC was in for a rough ride in the last year. And I think Texas and Oklahoma are in for a rough ride in the Big 12 every time they go on the road. With the Pac-10 or Pac-12, whatever you want to call it, basically dissolving, I think that takes some heat off of USC, where I don't think I think people are mad at USC, but it wouldn't be nearly as intense as it was. So in that sense, I think, people always want to send them out with a loss. I mean, the Big 12 in the last year that Nebraska was in the league, and the last year that Texas A&M was in the league, it was pretty heated, man. There were some absolutely classic games and some big-time crowds. And I forget, I believe it was Nebraska playing in the Big 12 championship the last year that they were in the league. It might have been Nebraska. I might be forgetting. But either way, it got really, really heated. So I think that matters. As far as your final season, I don't think it really matters. I think the thing that matters is your first season. I think you can make a first impression on a league's fans.
What matters is your media rights payout, David. Like we've established this.
Exactly. I think I think Texas A&M with the Johnny Football bonanza really, really affected their view from the rest of the league. That we talked about this in the Johnny Football Doc pod. There was a perception that A&M couldn't compete, and they literally did away with that pretty much overnight because they showed that they could compete. Missouri, for as many jokes as people get off about Missouri and the SEC, they did win the East, and albeit a down East, they did win the East twice. I believe in 2 of their first 3 years. I forget what the timeline was, but Gary Pinkel got them going and won the East a couple times. So I think that can help you. I think it's way more important what you do when you first get there rather than what you do on the way out. But I do think that if you leave and the rest of the league is mad at you, which I think Texas and OU are the only schools that are really going to catch that, it's tough. It's tough on the way out.
I think that there will be some spiteful moments for Texas and Oklahoma this season. And I will enjoy watching all of them. I think Texas plays at Baylor. Those kinds of games I think will be fascinating to sort of see.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you. The Pac-12 is just like, it's a heap of sadness. Like I don't think anyone, like the spite factor with the Pac-12, I just don't think is going to be there the way it will be with Texas and Oklahoma. But I think even that I was looking at Texas' schedule today, and I was confused why they were playing 2 non-conference games in October against Houston and BYU. And then I remembered, oh, wait, those are actually conference games.
Yes.
So, it's like I don't think Houston is going to care that they're leaving or BYU is going to care because they're like, we really appreciate it because that's why we're here in the first place. So it's even that is a little bit convoluted. So it's like I think when A&M left that last Texas A&M game, like that was a spite bowl, and like that's a great part of college football. I'm not sure if anything is going to rise quite to that level. Maybe Bedlam, right? Like that would be one that could get a little bit salty, a little bit saucy. That may be more of like a must-see television programming than it would be otherwise.
I covered the last Texas A&M game, one of the 5 most memorable nights of work that I have had. And it was on a Thanksgiving, and I didn't even mind, but I was a little bit younger then. And most importantly, I don't believe I was married when that game was was happening. No, I wasn't. So me having to work on Thanksgiving night, hey, I'll be back through the next day. Now that would play a little differently at home. But I do think it's the one thing I think with that question before we move on is there is a new America's team, and they are powered by the turnover chainsaw, and they are the Oregon State Beavers. Folks, if Oregon State can get hot, you are going to see people back in the Beavs as hard as you have ever seen a nation get behind a team. And, oh, man, if you haven't seen the turnover chainsaw, you need to. Because in general, college sports needs more power tools on the sidelines, whether they be celebratory, utility, whatever. More power tools on the sidelines can only enhance the sport. So that's going to be my campaign for the next year. We have another question from Michael D in the comments. Asking about kicking out cellar dwellers like Vandy and Rutgers. Couldn't the football interested schools just make their own league? Let the underlying school remain Big Ten academically and with other sports. It seems pretty easy to envision how a football team could be kicked out. So I think what we're talking about here is the idea that I think should happen, but logistically is a nightmare, and that is a football breakoff. Because I think most everyone in the entirety of college sports would love to get to that point where, okay, we're going to do this insanity with football because travel, quite frankly, is not that big of a deal in football. Just games are on Saturdays. You only have 12 of them a year, and that's 4 at most, 5, 6 road games, probably closer to 5. You have a couple cross-country trips, but you're leaving on a Friday, afternoon if you need to. It's not that big of a deal. But for everyone else, it's a nightmare. So if you want to do this insane bi-coastal Big Ten thing, for football, it's stupid, but logistically is not that big of a deal. But getting there, I think people would love to get there and go back to regional conferences with the non-revenue sports and maybe even basketball. I think basketball is really a complicated conversation. We got to have our basketball people in here to discuss the logistics there. But especially now, I'm not even sure how you get there.
I mean, yeah, very complicated, but not impossible. I mean, Notre Dame is independent in football, all ACC in Olympic sports, but Big Ten in hockey. I mean, you've Connecticut's situation. They're in the Big East, but football is just sort of adrift. It's not it can be done. It should be done because football should drive decisions, but there's no reason it should drive decisions for track and field.
Yes.
Or for men's or women's soccer. It makes absolutely no sense. And look, if the conferences wanted to extend an olive branch to the student athletes and say, actually, we are thinking of your welfare, this would be a pretty straightforward way to do it. Because what they're going to ask these other sports to do really is unconscionable, especially if you're trying to get some kind of NIL stuff passed in Congress. I mean, the college sports and the people who run it are the villains in the story, and that they're not going to be able to undo all the damage that has been done. But while it's not uncomplicated, the fact that you could certainly have a Pac-12 style every other sport conference. Rutgers could be with Seton Hall in the Big East and basketball. Mm-hmm. It seems doable. You just need some imagination. You need people to work together in good faith, which is the sport is yeah. I'm just sort of talking myself out of the whole discussion right now.
Yeah, I think in general, well, first of all, I was told actually that they had the student athletes' best interest at heart with all this. And that everything they do in athletic departments, they think of the athletes first. So I don't know what you're talking about. To me, who among us in college has not taken a cross-country flight on a Wednesday and gone to school the next day after a heated athletic competition? That's just part of the college experience, is it not? I'm lost of why people are up in arms about this. Everyone does that, do they not? I don't know.
You know, I don't want to tune off our listeners, but I went to DePaul University, Division III, and while I was there, we were in the Southern Collegiate Athletic Conference. We were in Indiana, and there were teams in Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee. It made absolutely no sense, and it all fell apart within years. Like I think it lasted maybe 4 or 5 years, and then people were like, "Wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense," and that it's not going to make any more sense for Division I track and field or Division I baseball than it did for Division III everything. So that people have tried this before. It's been a disaster. I mean, what was it? The Big East had TCU for like a hot minute. Like
I forgot about that. Yes, for about it was less than a year before they got the bullpen tap up to the Big 12. So
yeah, so it's like people have tried this. That. It's not a good idea. Like there's enough case studies out there that this will be a disaster. I don't know why we need to keep sticking our head into the fan on it.
Pete, I feel like we need to go down a brief DePaul rabbit hole because I have a question for you. I am aware of something called the Ubben Lecture Series at DePaul University.
Yes.
One, have you heard of this? 2, what is the deal? And 3, when will I be asked to participate?
I have heard of this. I've attended some. I think when I was a student, Bill Bradley came, former college athlete at Princeton and basketball player. But I don't think that your last name has anything to do with it. So
well, we were going to name the podcast Ubben Lecture Series, but I got vetoed on it. So
I like that really would have resonated with me and probably a couple hundred subscribers. I don't know about anybody else, but yeah, I did attend some Ubben Lecture Series. I think that maybe Brad Stevens was a recent speaker in the Ubben Lecture Series since he's also a DePaul alumnus. So yeah,
I have a lot of questions, so we need to. I need to work the back channels, Pete. I need to be given a spot here. Let's talk about some actual football, kind of. Pete, I'm going to tee up for a Notre Dame question here. I actually am curious about this as well. Well, the start of fall camp perpetually brings unbridled optimism. Everyone's undefeated, of course. Do you think everyone is overhyping the potential of the Notre Dame offense? Yes, Sam Hartman is a massive upgrade at the most important position. The line and running backs are talented and deep, but receiver lacks a true number one target. A dominant offense needs great receivers, and Notre Dame seems to be severely lacking compared to the other CFP contenders. Pete, I'll put you on the spot. Yards per play, what does Notre Dame need to rank to finish in the top 10, and what do you think they will rank?
Well, I mean, when it comes to Sam Hartman, Notre Dame's been in camp for about a week and a half. From everything I can gather, I don't think we're overhyping him. He is, maybe junior year Jimmy Clausen or going back to Brady Quinn before that. I think he'll be their best quarterback since then. Mm-hmm. Yards per play, they are not dynamic at receiver. They have a whole ton of question marks. They're hoping that there are a couple freshmen, Jaden Grayhouse from Austin, Texas, and then Rico Flores from Northern California. They're hoping that they can, be guys. But it's been a minute since Notre Dame's had like a dude at receiver as a true freshman. So I think banking on that is a mistake. But I think Notre Dame, 6.5 yards per play would put them at the back of the top 25 last year. Mm-hmm. That would be a good finish. To me, like, if anyone listening to this podcast watched Notre Dame, Ohio State last year, which was watched by more than 10 million people, again, like that, who knows what the final score was, but 10 million people watched it. You saw Notre Dame sort of concede offensively before the game started because they knew they just weren't going to be able to keep up. That's not going to happen this year. When Notre Dame plays Ohio State at the end of September, when they go to Clemson at the beginning of November, when USC comes here, like, they're not going to play sort of like a four corners offense. They're going to go out and I think chuck it around with Sam Hartman. So I think that from a fan point of view, Notre Dame's, I don't know how many more games they'll win than last year. I think that they'll win at least one or maybe two more, but they're going to be a much better project to watch because of Sam Hartman. And I think that's like, I don't think that I'll come back on the show when the season starts, but if Drew Pine is balling at Arizona State and Tyler Buchner wins the job at Alabama, I will say I am wrong. I do not know what I was talking about. That the problem was the coaching and the scheme and all that stuff at Notre Dame last year. But I have a very strong suspicion that by the end of September, Alabama's starting quarterback is probably not going to be Tyler Buchner. I don't know what's going to happen with Drew Pine at Arizona State. And I think Sam Hartman, people are going to be like, oh, that's what it's supposed to look like. And it just did not look like that at all last year. And Notre Dame sort of conceded that point before games started against other teams with high-powered offense.
Yeah, by the way, Pete, are Georgia fans invading your living room mad we haven't talked about them on this pod yet?
It's that's a sensitive topic around here because it's like I don't know, the Georgia game, if you remember aerial shots of that, it would look like a bowl game.
Yeah.
People are not happy about that and already on edge about Ohio State doing the same thing. That's a future story on The Athletic about how Notre Dame is trying to keep the red out of its own stadium.
It is. I'm very curious. So I took some paternity leave this year, so I didn't get out as much as I would have liked, but I did go out to Arizona State for a few days. Saw a practice or two of theirs. I liked what I saw from Drew Pine. How do Notre Dame fans sort of view him and his exit? Because I don't know that he's going to be like a 3,500 yard guy, 30 touchdowns this year. But I think he can win some games at Arizona State. I think he's going to have that job. I think he's going to do very, very well out there. But what's the perception of him on the way out?
I think it was kind of a good Notre Dame, like kind of a feel good, try hard story. But then the ending sucked because he opted out of the bowl game when he was the starting quarterback to go in the transfer portal, which like, some guys opt out of bowl games because they're going to the NFL draft, and some guys hit the transfer portal because they weren't playing. I don't think there's a lot of like hitting the transfer portal because I got to find my next job because I'm not going to win this one.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to walk out on the team. Like that really soured people on the whole story. I think he got a lot out of his ability, but I mean, he's 5'10" with like a average arm at best. It just, he's not very toolsy, and there were moments there, like especially the beginning of the year when he came in after Tyler Buchner got hurt. Like I tracked like depth of targeted pass in the Cal game, which is first start, and I think it was less than 1 yard. Like he could not throw the ball down the field. They wouldn't let him throw the ball down the field, and the passes he was throwing were like he was hitting guys in the ankle. So he got it together, but it felt like they won games in spite of their quarterback last year instead of because of him. I mean, it's like you look back at the Clemson game, like, oh, Notre Dame was great. They won 35-14. They like blew him off the field. Drew Pine, I think, completed single-digit passes in that game. Like they had a punt block, and they relied on Clemson to implode offensively. That was Notre Dame's big moment. The quarterback had very little to do with it. So that's why I think it's like Notre Dame has not won games because of their quarterback in a while. And I think that's what Sam Hartman's going to do.
I will say if Kenny Dillingham can revive Mr. Bo Nix, I like his odds of doing some zoots up with Drew Pine. I like what I saw from him in the spring. We'll see. It's early.
Yeah, they play USC like pretty early in the year. I think I'm very interested to sort of see how that one shakes out.
Well, if USC plays tackle optional again, they may have some problems. We'll close with this. Joe wants to know NIL for high school seniors. I want to know what happens when a 5-star recruit, goes to school A for a fat $2 to $3 million 4-year NIL deal, but maybe the school goes 7-5 or their coach gets fired. If the same recruit portals to school B, isn't the old collective on the hook for the previous NIL deal? Complicated question, Joe. I'll tackle it in a couple ways. One, the big 7-digit deals, the exception more than the rule. For recruits, we know of one I don't know of any others. I've heard, but there's not a lot out there. So let's start there. That there's not a ton of guys who haven't played a college snap making 7 figures. There are at least one that we know of, but there's not a lot. The answer to the rest of your question is much more complicated because it depends on the contract. Getting the contracts is very, very difficult. These are all private entities. The school, the player, they're not subject to FOIAs. This is why we can get coaching contracts very, very quickly, except for you, Pete. Sorry.
Yeah.
But most of us can get coaching contracts because you go to public universities, and unless you're coaching at Vandy or Northwestern or Duke or whatever, Baylor, it's very easy to get your contract. Very quickly. Like a lot of times, like the day that they sign the memorandum of understanding, we can get the terms of the deal. NIL is a lot more difficult. So what is happening generally is that there are deliverables in these contracts, and they are worded as such that the player must do a lot of these deliverables in person in Gainesville, Florida, or in Eugene, Oregon, or in Knoxville, Tennessee, because it is not explicitly contingent on them being a player for the local university team, because that would be illegal and that would be inducement, Pete. But if you can't complete the deliverable because perchance you maybe decide to play at another local school's university for whatever reason, most schools are willing, or most collectives are just going to tear up that contract and say that is what it is. Now, what you might have in the future, and I'm doing a story about the NIL marketplace, you might have some buybacks that basically say, that essentially handcuff you from, you can't transfer after 1 year because you have to pay back a bunch of the money that you get. And then if you sign that contract, you sign that contract. You have to word it in a way where it's not sort of an inducement. And if you have a lot of leverage, you can probably get yourself out of that. But that might be coming in. I've heard from a lot of people in the collective space that trying to figure out how to word these deals that precludes you from transferring, it will be a real thing. But if you sign a deal and the coach gets fired and whatever, and you stay, you're not going to see a lot of collectives just like saying, we're not paying you anymore because we don't think you're good. Because then you have a disgruntled person, and then you can say, well, this is pay for play. It's very easy to sort of play like that. And also, if you're a collective, you have to manage your relationships on the team. And if you just decide, well, you're not getting results, you don't get the money anymore, well, that's going to be a problem for you with the coaching staff, with the roster, with trust, with all that. So this is not a scenario that I think will happen. What do you make of the current landscape and this question, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the Jaden Rashada situation in Florida. Like, once that happens to you around Florida, like, you don't come back from that from a reputational standpoint if you're the collective. But like the regionality of the deliverables, like hypothetically, let's just say you were a 5-star quarterback who's a freshman at UCLA, and you're disgruntled because you maybe are not going to win the job. Could you go to USC? Like, is that local enough that you could still meet those deliverables and it wouldn't be that big of a deal?
That's an even more complicated question.
Yeah.
Because I think if you're a collective at one of those schools where there is another state U in your town, which is rare, but you'd have to figure out how to word it in a way that it made sense. A lot of it, though, is like you'd have to appear at these event series. And if you transfer, it's going to be uncomfortable for you. Like, even if you went, if Rashada had figured out, hey, I'm going to keep this money. I'm going to go to Florida State, and I'm still going to make it to Gainesville for all these events.
Yeah, the booster club in Florida.
Yeah, they're not going to be super thrilled to see you there. And, like, I think there is a wink between collectives and athletes that just says, like, hey, like, there's a limitation here, like that we're not going to do that per se. But we're so young and it's so new that we haven't seen a lot of these contracts or transfers, or we haven't seen it pushed on or tested very much. And I'll be very curious to see if we reach that point sometime soon.
Yeah, because I mean, Notre Dame's collective, the way that they've handled things so far has been much more sort of like team-based, where every player is making the same for kind of like the community service charity aspect of it. Kind of
they hate
more,
winning. That's what you're saying, Pete.
Yeah, more the philanthropic, where the backup middle linebacker makes up the same as a starting quarterback. And you're like, well, that's not sustainable. But
sounds like a conference.
Yeah, it just is not. And I guess with collectives, I guess that's fine. It's the more like pure, like for-profit stuff that fascinates me, and Aspire with you've written about extensively with Tennessee. Like that's, I think there's certainly a place for that, but I can't wait to see where we are 2 years from now. Like, are they out of money? Did they turn a profit off this? Like, did winning feel so good that it was worth like taking out a second mortgage to make it happen? I don't know. I don't know the answers to that, but it's like I don't think the market is going to ever be normal or rational, but it's going to be more rational or more normal than it was.
Yeah.
Like Notre Dame had a player who was transferring or thinking about transferring, ultimately did later. And there's NIL conversations, and like talking to people around here, they're just like, well, how much is player X worth? We don't know. We have no idea. Like,
I'm writing that exact story, Pete.
Yeah.
Thanks for the plug.
how much, like, how do we value that position? Like, is is a quarterback worth 10 times more than a running back, like in the NFL? What about an edge rusher versus safety? I have no idea. I don't think these schools have any clue either. They're just, you hear these numbers on these contracts, and like, I'm with you. They're like, I'm assuming that they're all junk. But 6 figures for top recruits, like that seems reasonable to me. If you're a 5-star edge rusher, I think you would go into your recruitment thinking that you're gonna find a 6-figure NIL deal somewhere for you, and that's
surely.
I think that's certainly in bounds. But how they word it, so it's regional and you can't transfer. Like, I don't know. It's like if the player transfers, he's probably not performing. So if you're the collective, aren't you just like, okay, you're off our books? Like, I would think ultimately that'd probably be a positive.
Well, I actually think it won't be a big deal, because if you're making $85,000 at X school and you can't get on the field, why would you transfer? It's actually a motivation to stick it out, because if you're a former 4-star recruit and you haven't done anything, and you're a third-year sophomore and you're still making $85,000 a year, you're not making that if you transfer down to the MAC or you transfer down to the Sun Belt or whatever. So you either give up that money and play on the field, or you keep sticking it out at your school. Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't, but you've got, money at the end of it. And I do think, well, 2 things. One, there's this idea that the money will dry up because, well, this recruit didn't work out. Well, hey, here's the thing. He may not work out, but it's very easy to convince boosters. But this next guy, you got to see this next guy. And then
the entire premise of recruiting.
Yes. And then if you say, well, he didn't work out, it's like, okay, maybe he didn't work out, but if we fire the coach, the next recruits, those guys are going to work out.
Yeah.
And I think the schools that play ball with their foundations and are not sort of have an idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, and don't freak out if a major donor says, hey, instead of giving you my 6-digit, 7-digit donation to the foundation, I'm going to give it to the collective. The schools that figure out that that's probably a good thing and you might make that back up, I think those are the ones that are going to do well in the next iteration of college football in the NIL sphere, as long as collectives are doing this in recruiting. And not all of them are, but a lot of them are. I think that story will be very interesting. We'll get it. We're working on it. We're working on it.
Yeah, because it's like, I'm with you. It's like, I think there's a 2-track system that can work here. There's the everybody gets something, but if you're a dude, you get something times 8, something times 10. Because I think these schools, you've got to even the 3-star recruit, you got to be like, all right, we've got a $25,000 a year, charitable work type of collective going. Like, there's a space for that. That makes the system work. But if you're a 5-star quarterback, like, that's $25,000 a year is probably not going to cut it.
No.
You got to have some flexibility to scale up when you get to that situation.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for listening. This has been our Mailbag podcast with Pete Sampson and David Ubben. We have talked a lot of realignment, talked some Notre Dame, talked a little bit of on-field, kind of, but there's a lot of stuff happening, Pete. So thank you guys for listening, for tuning in. If you're not already subscribed to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you want your podcast, you should do that because you can get this delivered directly to your device immediately. And subscribe to us on YouTube as well. You can watch all kinds of videos and reels and shorts and all that stuff from these podcasts. And of course, subscribe to The Athletic. But leave us a review, leave us a rating on those podcast services. It always helps. And be nice. And a 5-star rating is always appreciated. Once again, for Pete Sampson, I'm David Ubben. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for tuning in.